have been asked, more times than I can count now, what I was thinking when I stayed. The question comes from journalists mostly, though once it came from a Cathara elder, a bronze-ridged ancient the size of a freight barge, eyes like slow fire, voice like gravel rolling down a hillside, and even then my answer was the same. I was not thinking much of anything. I had a pot of broth on the camp stove. The temperature had dropped, and leaving felt wrong. That is the whole of it. That is everything. My name is Lenny Voss. I am 56 years old. I have worked kitchen service for 31 of those years, the last 11 of them at the Vasseth Kara Sanctuary up in the high country above Solith Ridge, where the draconic community maintains what they call a healing ground. It is not a hospital, not precisely. The closest human word is temple, though that gets it only halfway right. The chamber floors are stone, cut from the ridge itself, and the vaulted ceilings are high enough to accommodate a spread wingspan. In the warmer seasons, light comes through the clerestory windows in long angled shafts, and the dust motes hang in them like slow snow. There are beds, stone platforms, really worn smooth by centuries, and there are healers, and there is the smell of something the dragons bring with them, a mineral warmth like sun on old slate that I have never been able to name in any language I know. My job was the kitchen. 3 shifts, split between myself and 2 younger workers, Dava and Pell, good people, steadier than their ages suggested. We fed the sanctuary staff, the visiting healers, and occasionally the patients themselves when the healers cleared it. Dragon dietary requirements are not a simple matter. I spent the better part of my first year learning what I was and was not supposed to offer, and I still kept a laminated reference card on the inside of the pantry door. But I learned. That is the sort of person I am. Quiet, methodical, not prone to panic. My ex-husband used to say I had the emotional temperature of a damp stone, which he meant as an insult. I took it as a compliment and still do. The sanctuary sits on a narrow shelf of the ridge, carved into the rock face on its north side, open to the valley on the south. Below the valley floor, 300 meters of vertical drop, give or take. The river bends west toward the lowland towns. The geology of the region is what it always has been, ancient, layered, and under pressure. The ridge has been there for longer than human memory. The draconic community has been there longer still. I had been working at the sanctuary long enough to understand certain things without needing them explained. I understood that patients were not discussed with kitchen staff, and that the kitchen staff were expected to understand this and not press. I understood that the mineral resonance you sometimes felt through the stone floors in the evening hours was not a mechanical failure. I understood that the healers operated under protocols that had been established over a span of time I could not usefully measure in years, and that my role, stocking, prepping, serving, cleaning, restocking, was a supporting role in an institution that had been running since before either of my parents had been born and would be running long after I was finished with it. This suited me. I have never been a person who required a central role. I have been a person who requires a well-stocked pantry and a reliable simmer stock and a clear idea of what the morning service needs to accomplish. Give me those things and I am content. I had known for some weeks that Vasseth Kara was in residence. That is, that the dragon they called Vasseth Kara was in residence. The sanctuary has a policy of not sharing patient names with non-medical staff, and I respected that, but a kitchen worker is not invisible. You carry things in and out of rooms, you hear sounds through walls. And Vasseth Kara made a sound like no other patient I had heard in 11 years. A low, sustained resonance, somewhere below the range where you could call it a voice, that the stone of the chamber walls seemed to carry for minutes after she had stopped. You felt it more than heard it. It traveled through the floors, through the prep table, through the soles of your shoes into the bones of your feet, and it took a while to understand that it was not coming from the mountain itself. I had asked healer Meth Sora carefully and once, and she had said only that the patient was in late gestation and that we were to ensure the gallery kitchen was stocked for extended residency. I restocked the gallery kitchen. I kept the hours. I did my job. In 11 years at the sanctuary, I had developed a working understanding of what the patients needed in general terms without needing specifics. Temperature mattered. The high country got cold, even in the warmer seasons. And the heating exchange in the north wing was the oldest system in the building and the one most likely to need attention after any significant seismic event. Quiet mattered. The specific quality of quiet that the ridge provided, not silence, but the absence of the particular kind of intrusive noise that comes from populated places, the low-grade machinery of human habitation, I had come to understand, one of the reasons the sanctuary was where it was. And food mattered, in the indirect way that anything which signals care and attention and the maintenance of ordinary life matters to someone who is unwell. I had learned this from Meth Sora in one of the early conversations that had shaped my understanding of what kitchen work meant in this context. "What you do," she had said, coming through on a late inspection of the gallery kitchen stores, "is maintain the conditions under which healing is possible. You are not the healer. You are the person who ensures that the air smells of warm stock rather than cold stone. That matters. Do not underestimate it." I had not underestimated it since. The morning it happened, the morning everything cracked open, started the same as any other. Deva had the first shift. I came in mid-morning to prep the midday service, found the main kitchen already running, set to work on the long simmer stocks that would carry through afternoon. The forecast had flagged elevated seismic probability for the week, which in the ridge country means you secure the loose shelving and keep an eye on the crockery. We had protocols. I had followed them a dozen times in 11 years. You check the anchor bolts on the tall cabinets. You move anything breakable below shoulder height. You make sure the emergency stove canisters are accessible. I had done all of that on Monday. It was now Thursday. The first tremor came at 11:17. I know the time because I had just looked at the clock over the serving window, calculating how long the simmer still needed. The motion was lateral, a long, slow sway that made the hanging pots knock against each other and the liquid in the stock pot slosh in slow arcs. Duration, perhaps 8 seconds. Intensity, enough to confirm the forecast had been correct. Deva looked at me from across the kitchen. I looked at the pots. "Go check the gallery," I said. "Make sure nothing shifted onto the floor." He went. The tremor stopped. I turned down the heat on the stock and began counting. In seismic regions, you learn to count between tremors. The first one is rarely the worst. You give it 5 minutes, sometimes 10, and if nothing follows, the immediate risk has probably passed. If something follows, you follow the evacuation protocol. Staff through the North Service exit, down the switchback, to the assembly point at the meadow clearing 300 meters east. I was at 3 minutes and 40 seconds when the second tremor hit. This one was not lateral. The sound came first, a cracking, percussive report from somewhere deep in the ridge, like a joint giving way. And then the floor lurched vertically and sideways at once. And the tall cabinet I had anchored on Monday came off the wall anyway and took the upper shelf with it. And I went down onto my knees on the stone floor and grabbed the central prep table's frame and held on. The motion lasted, I cannot tell you precisely, longer than the first. Long enough that by the time it stopped, I had made a decision without quite deciding it. I was not going anywhere until I knew what was happening in the patient gallery. Dava appeared in the doorway, pale, hair sheeted with plaster dust. Lenny, the north wing showing cracks. The evac signal's going to go any. The evac signal went. A low, sustained tone, the kind that bypasses your thinking and reaches straight down to the part of you that is still an animal. "Go," I said. I was already on my feet, pulling my apron tighter. Stupid habit, completely useless. But 31 years of kitchen service has made the apron part of how I function. And I was already moving toward the gallery corridor. "Lenny, go, Dava. I'll be right behind you." He knew me well enough to know what that meant. He went. The gallery corridor was a 40-meter run, stone vaulted, with the clerestory windows above. Two of those windows had lost their frames. The light came in at wrong angles now, cut by new shadows where the wall had cracked. Plaster and dust lay across the floor in drifts. I kept moving. I knew this corridor by the feel of it underfoot, by the particular quality of the air in it, by the way the sound changed as you moved from the main building into the older stone of the gallery wing. 11 years will do that. A place gets into your body in ways you do not notice until you are moving through it in poor light with dust in your throat, and you do not slow down, because you do not need to. I do not know what I expected to find. A room empty of staff, perhaps. The healers would have followed the protocol. They had families in the lowland towns. They had sense. Or perhaps a patient who could not move under her own power, who needed someone to help her down the service exit. What I found was neither of those things, exactly. Vaseth Kara occupied the largest chamber in the gallery, the one with the double-height ceiling, the floor platform built wide enough for a full adult wingspan. The door to her chamber was ajar. I pushed it open. The light inside was the light of late morning through dust, filtered through a clerestory window that had survived intact. In that light, I could see the extent of what the tremor had done. A section of the ceiling vault, 2 meters by 3, had come down in the far corner, piling rubble against the east wall. The stone platform was intact. The occupant of the platform was not going anywhere. I had seen Vaseth Kara from the corridor before, through a partially open door, at a distance. At a distance, you understand she is large. You understand, intellectually, that you are looking at a creature measured in meters and decades. But understanding and seeing are different things. Up close, in a damaged room with the dust still settling, the scale of her resolved in a way it had not resolved before. She was deep charcoal in color, not black, but the gray-black of old forge ash, with a ridge structure along the spine and jaw that caught the light in layers, like the grain of old wood. Her wingspan, folded against her body in the constricted space, would have filled the room if opened. Her forelimbs were tucked under her, and her head, longer than I was tall, rested against the unbroken section of the platform, eyes half-lidded. She was breathing. The breath came in long, measured intervals, each one a sound like slow bellows. Her abdomen was distended in the specific way that late gestation produces. I had not studied draconic reproductive biology formally, but I had worked in the sanctuary for 11 years. And I had spoken to Healer Methsora enough times to understand what I was looking at. She was close. Whatever close meant for a dragon of her kind, the signs were legible. She was also alone. The healers had followed the protocol. They were, right now, walking down the switchback to the meadow clearing. I did not make a speech about it, even in my own head. I assessed the room. Ceiling structurally compromised on the east side, central vault holding, the door frame intact, no immediate evidence of further collapse pending. I checked the floor for fracture lines. I checked the window. I went back to the corridor, retrieved the camp stove from the emergency cache in the alcove beside the supply room. A small 2-burner unit on a folding frame, a 10-liter pot, 2 sealed canisters of field fuel, and I went back into the chamber with it. Vaseth Kara watched me set up the stove. She did not speak. Whatever communication draconic patients conducted with sanctuary staff, it happened through the healers, not through a kitchen worker who had never been formally introduced. But she watched. Her eyes tracked me with the deliberate attention of a creature that is too tired to waste motion on anything that does not matter. I took that as a reasonable indicator that I mattered in some limited way in that room. I had broth stock in the pot from the morning's simmer. I had transferred it into a sealed carry vessel, another habit, reflex, 31 years, and brought it with me without fully registering that I had. I poured it into the camp pot. I lit the stove. The small blue flame caught on the second try and held. The temperature in the gallery corridor had been dropping for the past hour. Elevation does that. The sanctuary sits at nearly 2,000 meters, and when the heating systems fail, which they do after any significant seismic event, because the exchange runs through the north wing, the cold comes in quickly. I did not know what temperature Vaseth Kara required. I did not know the specific thermal needs a dragon in late gestation, in distress, in a damaged stone chamber at altitude. But I knew that warmth was preferable to cold, and that the camp stove, small as it was, would make a difference in a room that was not much larger than a generous workshop. I kept the flame on low. I kept the broth at a simmer. I put my back against the undamaged section of the south wall, within reach of the stove, and I sat on the floor and I waited. Outside, distantly, through the intact clerestory window, I could hear the sounds of the evacuation. The evac signal had stopped. There were voices, far off, and once the mechanical sound of a relief vehicle on the ridge road below. At some point the voices faded and the road noise faded, and there was only the wind, which in the high country is a sound unto itself, and the low resonance of Vasithkara's breathing. She watched me for a long time. Then slowly, with the particular economy of movement of a creature in significant pain, she lowered her head until it rested flat on the platform surface, and she closed her eyes. I took that to mean she had decided I was not a threat. I considered that a reasonable working arrangement. I tended the stove. I refilled the pot from the second carry vessel I had brought. Habit, always two. The kitchen rule is always two, and kept the broth simmering, because the heat it produced was the point as much as the broth. The temperature held. Not warm, exactly, but not the kind of cold that gets into the joints and the deep muscles and makes everything harder. I pulled my work jacket from the loop at my waist, where I carry it in the colder months, put it on, and kept sitting. There is a quality to waiting in a damaged building that I had not experienced before, and that I have not been able to fully describe to anyone who has asked. The building does not feel stable in the way that buildings feel stable when they are intact. Every creak of settling stone, every small shift in the air pressure arrives with a rider, a small question that you cannot quite shut off, asking whether this is the precursor to something larger. I had assessed the room as well as I could. I had concluded that the central vault was holding, and that the immediate risk of further collapse was low. But assessed and certain are not the same word, and over the course of the first hour, I developed a working familiarity with the sound of settled, stone cooling and settling further, which is distinct from the sound of imminent failure. I could not have explained the distinction to someone else. I simply began to know it. The stove helped. Having a task helps. The broth needed watching, not constant watching, but the kind of intermittent attention that gives the mind something practical to occupy itself with, and that prevents the quieter and less useful thoughts from filling the available space. I watched the broth. I checked the fuel canister connection. I noted the temperature of the air against my hands and adjusted the flame marginally. I did the work that was available to me, which was small, and I left the larger work, the structural integrity of the vault, the well-being of the creature on the platform, the question of whether the relief teams knew to come to the gallery wing, to whatever forces were responsible for it. It was around the second hour that I began talking. I want to be clear that this was not a dramatic gesture. I am not a dramatic person. I talk when I am in a quiet room and waiting, because the silence gets loud after a while, and talking fills it in a way that feels productive even when it isn't. I used to do it in the kitchen during the long simmer hours, just narrating what I was doing to no one in particular. Dava and Pell thought this was mildly eccentric. I thought it was a reasonable use of breath. I told her about the stock. That sounds absurd, but it is what I had on hand. I told her what was in it. The base was a vegetable reduction, slow-cooked, with a mineral salt addition that the sanctuary dietary protocols specified for certain patients. And I had added the dried seagrass bundle that healer Methsora had cleared for extended residency prep. I told her the seagrass came from the coastal processing station 400 kilometers south, and that it arrived in the sanctuary twice yearly, packed in wax paper bales, and that it smelled like low tide and something older than low tide, something geological, and that I had always found it oddly reassuring. I am not sure she was listening. I am not sure she was capable of listening in that state, but her breathing, That long, slow bellows rhythm shifted after a while. Not to distress. Away from distress, if I was reading it right. A slight lengthening of the intervals. A slight easing of the tension visible in the ridge structure along her jaw. I kept talking. I told her about the sanctuary's kitchen, the layout, the equipment, the way the morning light came through the south-facing windows in summer, and lit the whole prep surface in gold for about 40 minutes before it moved. I told her about Dava, who was 23 and already better at sauce work than I had been at 30, and about Pell, who had a mechanical aptitude that was entirely wasted on kitchen work, but who had not yet figured that out. I told her about the simmer stocks and why I kept 2 varieties running at all times, and about the mineral salt ratios, and about the laminated reference card on the inside of the pantry door. I told her about the view from the serving window in the late afternoon, the way the valley below the ridge filled with shadow from the east, while the western wall of stone still held the sunlight, so that for an hour or so every evening the valley was bisected between shadow and light, and the river at the bottom caught the last of the sun and went copper bright before it too went dark. I had eaten my end-of-shift meals at that serving window more times than I could count, watching that happen. It was one of the things about the sanctuary that I had never found a way to fully account for, that the work was kitchen work, ordinary and repetitive and physical, and that embedded in it, inseparable from it, was that view. I told her about the first winter I had spent at the altitude, which had been colder and longer than I was prepared for, and about the way the ridge looks in the early morning in deep winter, when the frost on the rock face catches the first light and the whole thing seems to glow from within for about 10 minutes before the angle shifts, and it becomes simply a stone ridge again. I told her about the kind of quiet that comes with that. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a particular quality of silence that has weight to it, mass, the way deep water has mass, and that you can feel against your skin. She was breathing steadily. The rhythm had settled into something that felt, if I was reading it correctly, like the breathing of a creature that was in pain and was not pretending otherwise, but was not fighting the pain either, was simply being in it, the way you are in weather. Outside, the afternoon came on. The light through the clerestory shifted in the slow way it shifts in late season, moving down the wall, catching different angles of the stone. It was in the 4th hour that things changed. I do not have words for all of what happened in those hours, partly because I was focused on the practical requirements of the situation, and partly because some of it belongs to Vaseth Kara and not to me. What I can tell you is that the process was long and difficult, and that there were sounds I had not heard before and hope I never hear again in a context of suffering, and that I did what I could, which was not much. I kept the stove burning. I kept the room as warm as the small flame could manage. I stayed in my corner and I talked sometimes, and was quiet at other times, following what seemed to be needed. I added the second seagrass bundle that I kept in the deep pocket of my apron, the reserve that I always carried when running the gallery kitchen stock, because the gallery kitchen ran cold and the seagrass blend held the warmth better than the base stock alone. I did not know whether the smell of it meant anything to Vaseth Kara. It meant something to me. It was the smell of a functioning kitchen, of an ordinary working day, of the particular ordinary competence that 31 years of doing the same work well produces. And it was the thing I had to offer. The afternoon moved into early evening, in the way it does at altitude, faster than you expect, the light going from pale gold to flat gray in what feels like a single breath. I had not eaten since morning, a fact my body made clear to me in the 5th hour, in the blunt, practical way the body delivers such information without drama. I had a handful of dried fruit in my jacket pocket. I always carry something, again, 31 years. The habit is structural, and I ate it methodically, without much attention, keeping my eyes on the stove and the crack in the east vault and the long, slow intervals of Vaseth Kara's breathing. Outside, the wind had risen and then settled again. The ridge does that. It tests you and then it leaves you alone. At one point in the 6th hour, the ridge sent another tremor, smaller than the second, larger than the first, lasting perhaps 4 seconds. I watched the ceiling vault. It held. The crack in the east section did not propagate. The window held. I let out the breath I had been holding and checked the fuel canisters. Vaseth Kara made a sound I had not heard before. It took me a moment to understand what I was hearing. There was an egg. A single egg, there on the stone platform. The coloring was difficult to describe. A deep, smoky blue-gray, the color of the stone in the deepest part of the ridge, with a faint iridescence at the surface that shifted when the light moved. It was large. Relative to the chamber, relative to the platform, it was not enormous. Relative to me, sitting on the floor with a camp stove and a pot of broth, it was vast. Vaseth Kara's breathing had changed again. It was quieter, shallower. I got up from the floor. My knees had thoughts about this that I ignored. I crossed to the edge of the platform, staying at the perimeter, not climbing onto it, not approaching without understanding what was appropriate. And I looked at the egg, and I looked at Vaseth Kara, and I understood that the process that had been happening over the past 6 hours had reached its conclusion, and that what I was now observing was its aftermath. Her eyes were open. They were the deep amber of old resin, with a quality of light in them that I can only describe as geological, something that had been forming for a very long time, under very great pressure, and had arrived at itself. She looked at me, I said, because it was true, and because I could not think of anything else. You did very well. She closed her eyes. It was another hour before I accepted what was happening, and another hour after that before I accepted it completely. And even then, I did not accept it so much as accommodate it, the way you accommodate a thing that is too large to argue with. I had known in an abstract way that patients at the sanctuary sometimes did not leave. I had known it the way you know about weather systems in regions you have never visited, as a fact that exists somewhere outside your daily experience. Now it was inside my daily experience, and it was the largest thing in the room. And I was sitting on the floor beside a camp stove with a pot of broth at a simmer, and the egg was on the platform above me, and the room was cold, and I was the only warm thing in it. I took off my apron. This requires some explanation. A kitchen apron, in the context of a high country sanctuary in a stone chamber with a failed heating system and a camp stove as the only heat source, is not a meaningful insulating implement. It is a cotton duck canvas apron, commercial grade, with a wide chest panel and 2 deep front pockets. It is designed to protect clothing from kitchen mess. It was not designed for what I then did with it, which was fold it twice lengthwise, pull it into a shallow basin shape, and position it against the near side of the stone platform in a way that would provide some additional thermal mass between the stone and whatever I could do with my own body heat. I sat with my back against the platform, the apron folded around the egg's lower section where I could reach it from the floor, my knees drawn up, my hands in my pockets, and I maintained that position for the remainder of the night. I am aware of how this sounds. A canvas apron is not insulation. My body heat, conducted through stone, is not a meaningful supplement to a camp stove running low on fuel. I was not under any illusion that I was doing something technically adequate. I was doing what I had. That is the entirety of the reasoning. The camp stove ran out of the first canister sometime in the late evening. I swapped to the second, which I had been conserving, and lowered the flame further. The broth in the pot had long since gone past the point of simmering and into a kind of rich, reduced density that smelled more intensely of the seagrass than the original stock had. I had stopped adding water. The reduction itself held more heat for longer, and the smell of it filled the room in a way that I found inexplicably steadying. The night in the high country at this elevation is genuinely cold. Not the manageable cold of a building with a failed heater, but the cold of stone that has been absorbing altitude and dark for hours, releasing nothing, giving nothing back. I was wearing my work jacket and my apron was off my body and around the egg, and the second canister on the camp stove was producing a flame that was, by honest assessment, doing its best. I was cold. I accepted being cold as the correct exchange for the situation, and I stayed where I was. I talked sometimes into the dark of the chamber, not to Vaseth Kara, not after the 8th hour or so, when it became clear to me that she had moved past hearing. I talked to the egg, which I understand is not rational, but which felt correct in the way that some things feel correct in the absence of any better option. I told it about the view from the serving window. I told it about the frost on the ridge face in deep winter and the 10 minutes of interior glow. I told it that the seagrass came from 400 kilometers south and arrived in wax paper bales twice a year, and that I had always found the smell of it reassuring, and that this was probably a quality it could take or leave, but that I was offering it as information for what it was worth. At some point, I cannot tell you when, because I had stopped checking, I fell asleep against the platform. And when I woke, the clerestory window was showing the pale gray of very early morning, and the camp stove had burned through the last of the fuel, and the broth pot was cold, and my back was making a formal complaint about the stone, and the egg was still there, and it was warm, not the warmth of a machine or a heating system. A different kind of warmth, slightly uneven, coming and going in long, slow pulses, like a slow heartbeat you feel more than hear. I had my hand against it. I had apparently put my hand against it at some point in the night without being aware of making that decision, and the warmth traveled through my palm in those long pulses. And I sat there in the gray morning light with an apron and an egg and the remains of a cold pot of broth, and my back against a stone platform that held the still form of a creature I had not known by name, and I did not move. I was still in that position when the first relief team came through the gallery corridor. There were 4 of them, 2 in the mineral gray coveralls of the Ridge Emergency Service, 1 in the sanctuary's own healer blue, and 1 I did not recognize, smaller, with a careful way of moving that made me think medic or assessor. They came through the door and stopped. I looked up. "Morning," I said. The one in healer blue, not Methsora, someone I had not seen before, took in the room with a professional sweep, and then stopped on the egg and held very still. "Is that?" the assessor began. "Yes," the healer said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "Yes, it is." I started to stand, which required some negotiating with my spine. "The stove ran out a few hours ago," I said. "I tried to maintain the temperature. I don't know if it was enough." The healer was already moving carefully to the platform. She ran a slow scan with a device I did not recognize, moving it around the egg in a steady arc. Her face was the kind of face that does not show much when it is doing its job. But her hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. "It's viable," she said. One of the emergency service team put a hand on the wall, very suddenly, as if he needed the support. "She kept it warm all night," the assessor said, looking at me. I was not sure whether the remark required a response. I said, "Someone needed to. They were kind to me. They brought me water and something hot to drink and a thermal wrap for my shoulders. And one of the emergency team walked the corridor with me while the healer remained with the egg. And I answered their questions. What time? What happened? What did I do? In the patient, methodical way that I answer most questions. And then I sat in the gallery anteroom on a stone bench and drank what turned out to be a very adequate tea, all things considered, and waited for my knees to decide they forgave me. It was 2 days before I understood the full dimensions of what I had been sitting next to. I learned it the way I learn most things. From fragments, the way you build a picture from pieces that arrive at different times. Dava told me one piece 3 days after the event, standing in the temporary kitchen they had set up in the undamaged West Wing while the repairs were assessed. He had heard it from one of the healer team, who had heard it from the coordinator, who had received the formal notification, Vaseth Kara. Not a name I had been given during 11 years of kitchen service at the sanctuary that bore her name. I had thought it was a place name. The sanctuary had been called Vaseth Kara for as long as the records went. As long as anyone I had asked could say. It had not occurred to me to ask whether the place was named for a person. She was the last surviving matriarch of the Cathara bloodline. I want to say that again more slowly, because I had to have it said to me slowly before it landed. The Kithara bloodline. Old enough that the human concept of old does not usefully apply. The founding bloodline of the Kithara sovereignty. The draconic governance. Structure that predated most of the human nations I could name. That had its own history of something that could be called civilization across a span of centuries that made the word ancient feel inadequate. She had been in residence at the sanctuary for 4 months. She had chosen to spend her final gestation period in the high country, in the stone chambers of the ridge, in a place that bore her name. The egg she had laid, single egg, on the stone platform, deep blue-gray with the faint iridescence, was the last heir of the Kithara bloodline, the only one. I drank my tea. I looked at the wall of the temporary kitchen, which was canvas, and watched it move slightly in the morning wind. "Dava," I said, "did I miss the morning service yesterday?" He stared at me. "Lenny, I just want to know if there's anything I need to catch up on." He put his head in his hands. The formal notification from the Kithara sovereignty arrived on the 9th day. I know this because Sora brought it to me personally in the temporary kitchen and set it on the prep table beside the stock pot I was tending, and stood there while I read it, and I kept tending the stock while I read it because some habits are deeper than decorum. It was a physical document. That surprised me. I had expected something digital, a message, a formal communication of the kind that comes through channels. This was paper, actual paper. Though paper is not the right word, it was something that had the weight and texture of paper but the warmth of stone, and the lettering on it was in 3 scripts, 2 of which I could not read, and the third was the common script in a formal register that I had to read twice. The Kithara sovereignty acknowledged my presence in the chamber of Vasathkara on the occasion of the matriarch's passing. It acknowledged the actions taken, the stove, the broth, the maintained temperature, the night against the platform. It noted that the egg had been transported safely under sovereignty escort to the primary sanctuary at Keth Salara, where it remained viable, and that its viability had been confirmed by the Senior Healer Council. And then a paragraph that I read 3 times. The sovereignty wished to formally record, in the founding lineage oral record, in the written annex, and in the stone registry at Keth Salara, the name Vethlen Kara. Translated, the document said, in a note in the common script, as, "She who kept the bloodline's last warmth." The paragraph after that stated that this designation was not ceremonial. It was a lineage record, a record in the Kithara founding account, alongside the names of those who had kept the bloodline in every prior generation. She who kept the bloodline's last warmth, my name, rendered in 3 scripts, set into a founding record that was older than the country I was born in. I read it a 4th time. Sora was watching me. "I just kept the stove on," I said. "Yes," she said. "I talked to her about the seagrass." Sora was quiet for a moment. "The sovereignty received a full account," she said, "including the broth, the camp stove, and the seagrass." I looked at her. "They found it appropriate," she said, and something in her expression suggested she was choosing words carefully, that the last night of the founding matriarch's life had that quality, that it was warm and quiet, and someone was there, talking about ordinary things. I turned back to the stock. I tasted it, adjusted the seasoning, put the ladle back on the rest. "She should not have been alone," I said. That's all it was. Sora was quiet long enough that I looked back at her. "They know that," she said. "That is exactly what they know." The Kithara delegation arrived at the sanctuary on the 14th day. I want to be precise about what I mean by delegation, because the word does not carry the right weight. A delegation suggests a small formal group, representatives, perhaps an official or 2, someone with credentials. What arrived on the 14th day was 9 ancient dragons, the youngest of whom was, according to Sora, somewhere in the range of 300 years old, and the eldest of whom, the lead elder, who bore the name Vethasora, had a presence that you felt before you saw her, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before the weather turns. They came in the morning, from the south, Low over the ridge, not the theatrical approach of a military formation. Nothing like that. Just 9 large ancient creatures moving in loose arrangement through clear morning air, catching the early light on their ridge structures in ways that made the whole thing look, from my position in the temporary kitchen doorway, like something out of a painting I had not known existed. Old charcoal and bronze and a deep amber gold, all of them scaled in the true draconic way, wings folding as they settled onto the broad ledge to the south of the sanctuary entrance. Meth-Sora had told me they were coming. She had told me the previous evening, quietly, at the end of her shift, and had given me the option of being elsewhere. I had considered this for approximately 4 seconds and declined. I had a service to run. The kitchen was not going to manage itself. What I had not fully accounted for was that they would ask to see the kitchen. Vethasora made this request through Meth-Sora. About an hour after their arrival, after the formal proceedings I was not part of had concluded in the gallery, Meth-Sora came to the kitchen with a careful expression. "The lead elder would like to see the space where the stock was prepared," she said. "If that is acceptable to you." I looked around the temporary kitchen. Canvas walls, folding tables, 3 camp stoves. All the equipment we had managed to retrieve from the main kitchen before the east section was closed for structural assessment. "It's not really the kitchen," I said. "The main kitchen is still off limits." "She understands that." I said that it was fine, and I stirred the stock, and after a few minutes, Meth-Sora returned with Vethasora. Vethasora was smaller than Vasithkara had been, or appeared so, in the constricted space of the temporary kitchen, which was not built with ancient draconic visitors in mind. She was gray-blue, with the ridge structure of a creature that had carried a great deal of time, and her eyes were pale gold, not the deep amber of Vasithkara, but something lighter and more watchful. She moved through the kitchen door sideways, carefully, and arranged herself in the space with the particular economy of a large creature that has spent a long time navigating small spaces. She looked at the camp stoves. She looked at the stock pot. She looked at the laminated reference card that I had rescued from the main kitchen, pantry door and taped to the canvas wall because old habits are what they are. Then she looked at me. She did not speak in the common script that came through Meth-Sora afterward in translation. What she did was lower her head, slowly, until it was at the level of the prep table, which was approximately my height. It was not the bow of a formal ceremony, not theatrical, not performing for an audience. It was the gesture of a very old creature acknowledging something it recognized and had not expected to find here, in a canvas-walled temporary kitchen at altitude, in a woman in a work jacket with a laminated card on the wall. I did not know what to do with that. I did what I do when I do not know what to do, which is tend the stock. I offered her tea. Meth-Sora made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, very small and very quickly recovered. Veth-Asora communicated something through her, and Meth-Sora composed herself and said, "She says that the tea would be very welcome." I made the tea. I made it in the large field kettle we had brought from the emergency stores, because I did not know the appropriate volume for an ancient draconic elder, and erring on the side of too much seemed safer than erring on the side of too little, and I set it in the wide bowl I had found in the salvaged equipment, and I put it on the prep table. We sat, she in her arrangement in the kitchen space, and I on the stool at the far end of the prep table, and there was a long period of quiet while the tea cooled, and the wind moved against the canvas wall, and the stock simmered on the back burner. In that quiet, I was aware of the specific strangeness of the moment in a way that I had not let myself be during any of the preceding days, when there had been too much to do to be aware of much beyond what was in front of me. An ancient draconic elder of the Cathara sovereignty was sitting in a canvas-walled temporary kitchen at 2,000 meters altitude, waiting for field kettle tea to cool in a wide salvaged bowl, while I sat on a stool that had a wobble in the third leg and stirred a stock that was developing very well for a temporary sit-up. I noted this. I noted it and filed it and went back to the stock, because the stock was what I had to tend. She spoke then at some length. Methsora translated. The Kethara founding record, Vethasora said, was not a document of great deeds. She was precise about this. She said that there was a common misunderstanding among those who did not hold the record, which was most people, that founding records were the history of great acts, heroic interventions, moments of high decision. This was not what the Kethara record was. The Kethara record was a record of the moments when someone was present, when presence was what was needed. That was all. Someone was there. The matriarch was not alone. The bloodline's last warmth was kept. She was quiet for a moment. Methsora waited. She added that it was known in the record that the kitchen worker talked about seagrass, that the specific variety of seagrass, its origin point, its method of packaging, and its smell had been noted, that the word used in the oral record for this quality of detail, the quality of caring about, the small specifics of an ordinary thing in the middle of a frightening night, had no direct translation into the common script, but that the nearest approximation was something like the grace of ordinary attention. I looked at the laminated card on the canvas wall, the grace of ordinary attention. I had been paying attention to stock composition and dietary protocols and fuel canister levels. I had been doing my job, or the nearest thing to my job that the situation permitted. Vethasora spoke again, and Methsora translated that the oral record had additional detail, which she wished to share, with my permission. I said that I was willing to hear it. She said that the account described the point in the night. The senior healer had reconstructed the timeline from the physical evidence in the room, and from what she had understood from the egg itself, which communicated in ways that did not translate easily. When the camp stove ran out of the first canister, that at this point, rather than conserving fuel and allowing the room to cool, I had moved to maintain the temperature by other means, that I had removed my apron, the apron noted in the account, and positioned it against the platform, that I had stayed, she said, and Methsora's voice was carefully level as she translated, that this decision, made in the 4th hour of a frightening night in a damaged building, with no instruction to do so and no expectation of recognition, was what the founding record called the act, not the broth, not the stove, the staying. I sat with that. Outside the temporary kitchen, the morning was doing what mornings do at this elevation in the turning season. The light was moving in that slow, angled way that finds the parts of the stone that the summer light misses, and the wind off the ridge had the smell of distance in it, the particular clean cold of high air that carries nothing from below. I did not know who she was, I said, Methsora translated. Vethasora's response translated back was, we know, that is in the record also. I thought about that for a long time, sitting on the stool in the temporary kitchen with the stock on the back burner and the tea cooling in the wide bowl. The egg, I said finally. How is it? Something changed in Vethasora's expression. I will not claim to be fluent in draconic expression. I am not, and would not pretend to it. But something shifted behind the pale gold eyes that was not formal or ceremonial. It was the shift you see in a person's face when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone asks about it with genuine interest. Methsora translated the response. It warms itself now. It is beginning to do what it will do. I nodded. Good, I said. That's good. Outside, through gap in the canvas where the door seal had not been quite right since we set up the temporary kitchen, the morning light was moving across the stone of the ridge in the way it does when the season is turning. Slower, more horizontal, finding the angles that the high summer light misses. The clerestory windows of the main gallery, visible through the gap, caught that light and held it for a moment before the angle shifted. I thought about the sound of Vasithkara's breathing in those hours, the long, slow bellows rhythm, the way it had eased slightly over the course of the afternoon until it was something that you might have called rest, if rest was what it was. I thought about the morning light on the clerestory windows of the main gallery in summer, coming in at a low angle for 40 minutes and lighting the whole prep surface gold. I thought about the laminated card and the seagrass in its wax paper bales, and the sound the mineral salt makes when you add it to a cold liquid. She knew I was there, I said. It was not a question, exactly. Methsora translated. She listened, and then she translated back. She chose the sanctuary, Vethasora said. She was not required to come to the ridge. There were other places, closer, larger, with more formal staff. She came here. She had come here, at intervals for a very long time. Since before the sanctuary existed in its current form, since before the current staff, since before the name was formalized in the records you use. She knew what the ridge was. She knew what it held. Methsora paused, then added the last piece of the translation. She knew who would be in the kitchen. I sat with that for a while. I am not a person who reaches for meaning in coincidence. I am a practical person, methodical, the kind who keeps a laminated card on the pantry door and maintains 2 carry vessels because the kitchen rule is always 2. I am the kind of person who, when something large and frightening is happening, addresses the nearest practical requirement, the stove, the temperature, the fuel canister level, because that is where my usefulness lives. I do not know if Vasathkara knew my name. I do not know if the particular kitchen worker on the mid-morning shift on a Thursday in a high-country sanctuary was a specific thing she had chosen, or whether any kitchen worker who stayed would have received the same record. I did not ask. It seemed like the wrong question. Maybe it was the right question, and I was simply not the right person to ask it. What I know is that I had a pot of broth on the camp stove. The temperature had dropped, and leaving felt wrong. That is still the whole of it. On the day the delegation departed, the afternoon of their second day at the sanctuary, when the 9 ancient dragons rose from the broad ledge to the south and turned toward the high country to the north, in the same loose arrangement they had arrived in, I was in the temporary kitchen running the late service. I heard them, the way you hear something that carries in the air above sound frequencies, that low, mineral resonance I had felt through the stone of the gallery chamber, carried now by the open air of the ridge, present for a long minute and then fading as they moved north. I turned down the flame on the back burner. I checked the stock level. I noted that we were going to run short of the seagrass blend by the end of the week and wrote it on the order list that was clipped to the canvas wall beside the laminated reference card. Deva was at the serving counter, stacking the midday dishes. He glanced at me and then at the order list. "You're writing the seagrass order," he said. "We're going to be short by Friday," I said. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not fully read. Something between exasperation and something warmer than exasperation. "Len," he said. "What?" "You're in a founding record. They wrote your name into the Cathara founding record. They said you kept the bloodline's last warmth." "I know," I said, "and you're writing the seagrass order." "Someone has to," I said, and I clipped the order list back to the wall, and I turned back to the stock, and I kept working. Outside, on the ridge above the valley, the afternoon light was moving the way it does in the turning season, long and angled and warm at the edges, finding all the places the summer light missed. In the main gallery, through the walls I could not see but knew were there, the clerestory windows were catching that light and holding it for a moment, the way they always did, before the angle shifted and it was gone. It was a good kitchen. The ridge was a good ridge. And the stock, if I tended it, would be ready by the dinner service. I kept tending it.